Welcome to another tarot video by your friend Matthew. It's been far too long. I apologize about that. But I'm back. We're back. So, the last tarot video I made was about the Hanged Man card, which is card 12 in the Major Arcana. And I've made previous videos about the previous cards in the Major Arcana, and I'm going in order. Starting with the Fool card, even though the Fool card is card 0, I mean, it makes sense that would come first. Although I would say that the Fool card kind of transcends the linear sequence of the Major Arcana, and it kind of stands outside / permeates the whole journey, the hero's journey, the fool's journey, throughout all these cards, which can be interpreted in a lot of different ways. The Major Arcana cards of the tarot, they obviously can be viewed as archetypal symbols or archetypal images, with even the Fool as an archetype, the Magician, the High Priestess, the Empress, the Emperor, the Hierophant, the Hermit, all these archetypal images that are imprinted in the collective unconscious, as Carl Jung said, imprinted in the human psyche, that can be seen in mythologies and stories all throughout the world, all throughout human history. We can look at it through an archetypal lens, or we can look at the journey throughout the Major Arcana as, like I said, kind of a hero's journey in the vein of Joseph Campbell's map of the hero's journey, which basically the hero or the protagonist, the main character of these mythological narratives that he's studied from different places in the world throughout different times in history that had a lot of overlaps and a lot of parallels and differences. And the differences were usually shaped by the different cultural codes, belief systems, and that sort of thing. So, and as I've mentioned on a previous video, I like to think about these sorts of things from multiple perspectives. And so it's fun to kind of play around with different lenses to look at it through. And one lens that I've thought about the Major Arcana through lately has been, the first 7 cards are kind of self-empowerment. The next 7, if there's 21 total, minus the Fool card 0. Second 7 would be self-deconstructing, or, deconstructing the self. And then the last 7 could be seen as, self-integration, or kind of reintegration of the transformed self after going through transformations, after going through breakthroughs along the journey. The Fool, which is all of us, the Fool has, gets challenged, just like in the hero's journey. The hero starts with this. The hero starts in the familiar world, and then gradually goes down into the unfamiliar world, literally or figuratively, and goes through trials and tribulations and challenges, usually meets some wise person that allows them to gain new insight and a new revelation that is kind of some elixir, I guess, like a metaphorical elixir that they can then take back with them to where they started. They by the end return. It's the retreat and return. So they return back to where they started with a transformation, a new wisdom, something to bring back to others. That's the way I see the hero's journey. That's the way that, Joseph Campbell sometimes described it. So at this point in the journey, the last card that we looked into was the Hanged Man. And just to remind you, the Hanged Man, hanging upside down, looking like he has kind of surrendered peacefully and has become confident to go his own way. He's upside down. He's like challenging norms. He's going against the grain. He's going against expectations. He's following his own weird, fearlessly. And so the Death card, it's a tough card to tackle, It's a tough card to completely unpack. I know that when I do readings for friends and stuff, and I pull this card, a lot of times people kind of get, they don't have a super pleasant reaction to pulling the Death card. But, I usually definitely lean toward the symbolic interpretation rather than a literal interpretation. So if somebody pulls this card, I'm generally not going to think that it's somehow suggesting that person is about to literally die. It's symbolic death. And this whole second leg of the journey, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. This is card 13. So this is the second to last card in the second leg of the journey, which, as I said, is kind of, to me, it seems like it's deconstructing the self. The second leg of the journey is deconstructing the self. And so this is one of the final stages, of deconstructing the self, because you're dying to the old self. It's a symbolic death of the old self, or to old patterns, to old habits, to old conceptions of oneself, to limited beliefs about oneself, to exhausted narratives about oneself. And so most spiritual traditions touch on this in some way or another. Obviously in Buddhism, this would be kind of becoming unattached to the ego, the narratives that we tell ourselves about ourselves that are just thoughts. They're just narratives. They're not, they're abstract. And oftentimes our narratives about ourselves limit us and keep us stifled and keep us restricted in ways that we don't have to be, and keep us suffering in unnecessary ways. So that's kind of the way it would be seen from a Buddhist perspective. Buddhism has the idea of no self. So I guess even beyond what I said about the ego, the idea in Buddhism of no self, which might sound scary at first, but really what that means is that there is no self. There is no individual self that is not interdependent with everything else. There's no isolated self. There's no independent self. There's no none of us has a self that is not shaped by countless factors that are intertwined with the web, and so that's why Buddhists talk about no self, is because there is no static, isolated self. Our lives, our relative selves in the world are constantly in relationship with tons and tons of different factors and people and living things that that shape everything about our lives. So, and then from kind of some schools of Hinduism, Advaita Vedanta would say that, we have to, well, not have to, but it's possible. It's possible that we can practice and realize a knowledge by identity, meaning instead of identifying with our bodies or our thoughts or our sensations or our perceptions or our feelings, we can identify with Atman or Brahman, the absolute, and realize that we are expressions of the absolute rather than these seemingly separate, isolated selves. So similar to Buddhism, but different framing, different terminology and stuff. And of course, in Christianity, rebirth, I would say, is applicable here. Dying to the old self, being reborn, being spiritually reborn, which I guess from a traditional perspective is linked to baptism and stuff like that. But again, I just usually lean towards symbolic interpretations of those sorts of things. So even baptism is a symbolic ritual that allows one to it symbolizes or represents a person's rebirth into some sort of new self that is either in closer relationship to God, or has they've cleansed themselves of sin, or kind of repeated karma or something, I would say. I mean, I know Christians don't usually use the word karma, but I see all of that tied together. I think that karmic patterns are patterns that we continue to perpetuate in our lives that usually cause unnecessary suffering. I mean, I guess on a neutral level, karma is just the law of cause and effect, so it's not necessarily positive or negative, but there are karmic patterns in our lives that we perpetuate that cause unnecessary suffering that we can actually dislodge ourselves from if we become aware of what is perpetuate, and we become aware of the ways that we have consciously or unconsciously perpetuated karmic patterns that cause unnecessary suffering. And so with that awareness and with the I would say either the surrender or the will that allows us to dislodge ourselves and to create new patterns that don't cause at least as much suffering, and hopefully sometimes at least create joy instead of suffering. And one last thing I'll say about rebirth, because it is the whole third section of the book I'm writing is about rebirth, but I'm looking at the idea of rebirth from a very non-traditional point of view, really, a looser point of view. But one way that I think about rebirth is that, we have a first birth where we're just born into this world as babies, and kind of are thrown into this world, as some philosophers have said. So we're thrown into this world. That's our first birth. But our second birth is the self that we choose, or the life that we choose. The person that we choose to be in the world. So there's this. So it's more active, and you're using your own agency to actually have an intentional type of personhood rather than a passive personhood. So that could be another way to look at rebirth. And those are all just ways to unpack this card a little bit, I would say, because to me, this card just represents a symbolic death, a death of some sort of old self. And obviously, with the death of the old self, there is the implication that there is going to be the birth of a new self. And throughout this whole second leg, we had the Hermit card who goes into the basement or the darkness with carrying his own light in order to discover the truth fearlessly about himself, about others, about the world. Shadow material, to discover the stuff that's been in the shadows, that's been overlooked or ignored or pushed to the side or pushed under the rug. On micro and macro scales, if you think about this, I know that sounds abstract, and I guess it is. The way I'm saying is a little abstract, but when you're thinking about your life in relationship to this archetypal journey and the tarot cards, going into the basement and looking at the things, looking at the shadow material that has been overlooked or ignored, consciously or unconsciously, I think about it as, all the kind of the mildewy boxes in the basement that we can open up, look at all the contents, keep what needs to be kept, throw away what doesn't need to be kept, sweep the floors, mop the floors, open up the windows, get all the cobwebs out of there. So that's a metaphorical way to look at it, but all of us have different types of shadow material on a personal level. And that shadow material relates to the way that we see everything, right? It relates to the way that we see others. It relates, it shapes our worldviews. It shapes our view of human nature. It shapes our values, all these things that kind of the shadow material in the basement is, playing a part in affecting the way that we live our lives and the way that we see our lives. So if in terms of doing self-experiment, if you're interested in this sort of thing, just honestly, to me, journaling is the best way to do it. Journal about, just kind of in the way that the Hermit card goes in there, carrying the light, the light of awareness, the light of fearlessness, to try to discover what has been overlooked, about yourself, about your past, about your hang-ups, about your strengths, about your skills, about your power. It's not just negative stuff, it's positive stuff too. A lot of times we don't want to own our own power or whatever, we don't want to realize how much power we really have, because then we feel like we have this, oh wow, now we have responsibility to use that power. And I think most of us would rather kind of stay passive in a way. So, and so you have the Hermit, and then, the Hermit has an epiphany of the Wheel of Fortune, which is the next card after the Hermit. And the Wheel of Fortune, to me, is all about just realizing interdependence, seeing from a bigger picture, seeing how everything is interconnected, seeing how all the factors that make you who you are in your personal life, that's the kind of web of things that make you who you are. But then on a bigger level, you look at, social structures and social systems and politics and economics and sociology and all these ways that societies are, each society is an interdependent network of causes and effects, and then internationally that's the case. So on a macro world level, you can start seeing how everything is connected, and then even look at cosmology and science and the cosmos and space and the solar system and the galaxy, the Milky Way and all this stuff. Start seeing from bigger and bigger perspectives instead of staying with a narrow view. That's part of the Wheel of Fortune. And then you have the Justice card, which is after we see all that interdependence, it's how are we going to, for one, we acknowledge that there is justice in that because everything is the way that it is because of how it's been shaped by all these infinite factors. So it's just we have to just accept reality as it is in all of its beauty and ugliness. And And we also have to, now with the new awareness of interdependence, we have to think, well, how can we help create and preserve more justice for ourselves and others, more fairness and love and freedom and opportunity and that sort of thing. And then you have the Hanged Man, which I already kind of mentioned, and then you have the Death card. So it's been kind of leading up to like shedding and shedding and shedding in a way, shedding things that, shedding limitations. When we're not looking at the shadow material, that's limiting because we're seeing from a narrow point of view, we're seeing from a tunnel vision. And when we're not seeing interdependence, we're not seeing ourselves as connected to a larger whole. That's limiting, and it keeps us feeling separate. It keeps us feeling disconnected and isolated, and sometimes disempowered even. And then when we're not seeing, the significance of justice in one way or another, that's limiting. So we're shedding these limitations, and then the Death card is like the ultimate kind of, okay, are you ready to really shed? Like truly shed, limiting beliefs about yourself and the world and others and the universe, anything that you need to let go of in order to, kind of like a caterpillar going through the chrysalis process, the whole thing has been like this chrysalis process, like at least the second leg of the journey. And now it's, the butterfly is about to hatch out of the chrysalis and fly or something like that. And, people talk about the different responses to this, this death figure coming in on a death horse. The little kid is showing reverence, and the priest figure is showing reverence, and you have this woman who's kind of showing reverence, I guess, but also seems to be almost like knocked out by the power of this figure. And I mean, the horse and the figure are definitely huge kind of compared to these other figures. You have another guy that's laying on the ground, presumably trampled over by this horse or dead, for some other reason. And so even though, it has some grim vibes to this card, I would say that as far as these other figures, it's like different people have different attitudes toward literal death, of course. Most of us are scared of dying. Some of us see dying as really meaningful because it gives vitality to life. There's a million different perspectives on death. A lot of religious people think that it's a gateway into the afterlife in some way. And so there's a lot of different views on it. As far as symbolic death, there's a lot of different attitudes toward that too. I remember when I was in college and I started meditating, my roommate was trying out meditation a little bit too, and he told me one thing that I'll never forget, which other people have told me too, and which I've felt sometimes myself. And the reason I remember it is because it seems like it's a common fear that people have with things like meditation. He said that when he meditates, it's hard for him to fully let go, to fully surrender, because he thinks that if he completely surrendered and kind of like relieved himself of the mental chatter or the thoughts, right, that he would like die. You know what I mean? Like he was a little bit playful with the way he said it, but he was also kind of serious. Like he kind of felt like he might die if he didn't have that internal chatter. And I totally understand what he means. I mean, we're so attached to that. We're so used to having that. And that's what we identify ourselves with, and that's how we like feel like a self, is that we're like talking to ourselves all the time. So it seems like, we can be afraid of letting that go, because then we're like, who are we without that? So people are generally afraid of symbolic death, letting go of the mental chatter, or letting go of the old scripts, as they say, the old narratives, the old conceptions of self, conception of other, all these things that keep us kind of confined. But the truth is that when you can at least get glimpses of letting stuff like that go, instead of it being terrifying, it can be liberating, and you can feel more spacious, you can feel more relaxed and open, because you're not like clinging so hard anymore, and you're not like obsessed with keeping those things going. And so I think that's what I got for this card. The good old death card. It's an important step along this journey. Until next time, peace.